All right, everyone. It is 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get us started. Good morning. I am Taylor Post, Swiftland's office manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Making Your Images Ready for the Web, and today's presenter, Laura Solomon. Laura Solomon is the Library Services Manager for the Ohio Public Library Information Network and a W3C certified front-end web developer. She's been doing web development and design for more than 20 years in both public libraries and as an independent consultant. She specializes in developing with Drupal. She has a 2010 Library Journal Mover and Shaker. She's written 3 books about social media and content marketing, specifically for libraries, and speaks nationally on both these and technology-related topics. As a former children's librarian, she enjoys bringing the fun of technology to audiences and giving libraries the tools they need to better serve the virtual customer. Please welcome Laura and enjoy her webinar this morning. Laura?
Thanks, Taylor. Hi, everyone. Can you hear my sound okay? We'll just do a little sound check before I get underway. If you can hear me, type hello. Tell me where you're from in the chat. I'm going to apologize. I'm starting to lose my voice a little. We're having a fun allergy season up north. Hello, folks. Oh, we've got some folks from Alabama, at least one. South Florida. My in-laws live in Key West, so I have some idea of Florida topography, although I'm a little partial to Key West myself. And New York. I used to live in New York. Lori, actually, that's where I grew up, is upstate New York. Hello, folks. So a wider geographic representation here than I was anticipating, which is fine. Syracuse. I used to go through the Syracuse Greyhound station many times in college. Wonderful. Tallahassee. So we've got a fairly wide, Lord knows, the Greyhound station. I'm sure it's changed in the 30-odd years since I have been through it. And Deb, I'm going to apologize in advance because having grown up in upstate New York, I tend to talk quickly, even though I now reside in the Midwest, where things are a little slower. So I hope that I don't outpace your signing. I always get a little nervous when I'm talking around interpreters, simply because of the speed. So good. I'm glad you're up for the challenge. I'll try not to make it horrible. I have a lot to talk about today, other than fun things about myself and all of you and where you're from in Florida. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk, obviously, about images that you're going to use on the web and online. So this is how I have broken things down in a very broad kind of a way. So the first thing we're going to look at is really some foundational material that you need in order to understand why one kind of image is better than another for certain purposes. We're also going to, I have a broad section called best practices. So a lot of do's and don'ts fit into this category. And then also, we're going to talk about social media specific, because that is also web related. And of course, the world of social media is very, very visual. By the way, just a quick tally, perhaps. If you could tell me in the chat, how many of you manage social media for your library? Whatever kind of library that is, just let me know. And if you're part of a team, that's okay. Or if it's something you do it doesn't have to be your only job. Very few people have that as their only job. So public, okay, high school library. Rhea says, I do for our department within the library. Helen says Instagram and Facebook. So we've got different kinds of libraries. We've got it broken up different kinds of ways, which is pretty normal for what I see in these kinds of sessions. So hopefully this will help you as well. So this is not just about your website. Many of the things I'm going to tell you today apply across the board, regardless of where your image is going to be used, as long as it's going to be used online. So let me put that disclaimer out fairly quickly, is that if you are purely a print person and you don't ever work with anything online, not a lot of this is going to apply to you, which is why the title of the webinar is Getting Images Ready for the Web. And the last section is free images on the web, and in this one in particular, I encourage you to share your own favorite sources. I've got a few of my own, and we'll talk a little bit about what you can and can't use here. So that's going to be a very quick section at the end. For those of you who have heard me speak before, please feel free to put your questions into the chat box as I go. I'm pretty good at interrupting myself and putting myself back on track, so don't feel like you're interrupting my flow. One of the things I really enjoy actually is engaging with folks as I go, because even I get tired of my voice after a while, and I'm sure you will too. And I'm looking at the chat right now. Stephanie says, not my only job, we are a press. Just put in press for the word library. Interesting, okay. And Ronnie says, a college library, and student workers help with social media. So that's helpful when you get the students in there doing some work, right? Okay, so let's start with that foundational material that I referred to as our first section. Still need these skills, says Stephanie. Yes. So this is where we're going to talk about different kinds of image formats and what's good for what, because sometimes there's a lot of confusion, especially if you work with different types. And most of us who work with either websites or social media, we work with more than one type, or we have the ability to convert from one type to another, and we don't always know which one to use for what purpose. So the very first thing we have to look at is sort of this broad breakdown into two types of images, which is raster versus vector. And hopefully you've heard these terms before, even if you don't know what they mean. So vector images, and we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these in details. Vector images are made of hundreds of thousands of tiny lines and curves, which are called paths, if you want to get into the technical specs for that, to create an image, whereas raster images are composed of pixels. And for many of us, we never go beyond the raster. But I want to talk about both of these because they have different purposes and you need to understand what they are. So diving a little deeper into that, vector graphics have to be created in computer software that's designed to create what it becomes an intricate wireframe type of image. And each line that you create includes defined node positions and locations, how long the line is, and any curves that it might have, and a color value. And because it has a very defined formulaic approach to drawing, each image can be sized and scaled repeatedly and without any limits, because you don't lose any resolution. It doesn't begin to look cloudy or pixelated, and you can identify a vector right away, usually by looking at its edges, right? Because a vector image will always appear smooth no matter how large you make it or how close you zoom in. Text actually is the most common form of vector image, and you probably didn't even realize it, but every time you're using text in an image, you're actually using a vector, not a raster, even though in Photoshop and other pieces of graphic design software, it treats it like a raster and it will save it as a raster. Fonts in their original state are actually vectors. And because no matter how much you increase or decrease a font size, for example, it never looks any different, right? You don't lose any quality there. So another advantage to using vector images is file size efficiency. Because the files are only identified, essentially it's a bunch of math, right? That's all a vector image is a bunch of mathematical descriptions. There's not individual pixels, so files are often much smaller than those of their raster counterparts. So vector images are much easier in many ways to transmit from one computer to another simply because they're smaller. But there's no perfect format, right? Because the most common problem with using vector images is compatibility. Vector images are often saved as native files from the program that was used to create the image. For example, I don't know if we have any Adobe Illustrator folks here, but you're probably well acquainted with the file format .ai, which is native only to Adobe Illustrator, but it's a very common vector format, and that's typically what it will save things in. There are not a whole ton of vector formats that are compatible with everything, unlike raster formats that we'll be talking about in just a moment. So you have to have that software available or some other software that can open that specialized type of file format in order to use a vector, even though they're smaller and they're easier to move around. Now, those of you, well, probably everyone here, I'm going to guess, you probably have a logo for your library. And vector images are the #1 option when you're designing or creating a logo or many other kinds of illustrations, but especially logos. Because of the way that they're created and then they're saved, you're going to have more flexibility with making changes and be able to use them at a variety of sizes. You know, if you take something that you create in Photoshop and you blow it up from its original size, which might be small enough to use in the corner of your website, and try to make that big enough to use on, say, a big banner you're going to use in this year's parade, you're going to be in for a rude awakening, right? It's not going to work too well because those are typically not vectors. This is why logos always need to be vectors. They need to be created in some kind of software that allows you to cleanly resize things. So that's, if you're thinking about getting a new logo, or you don't have a vector logo, it's time, because as you may have already experienced, Stephanie says it's so expensive too. Wasn't sure what that was in reference to, but maybe I can catch up. So anyway, logos and vectors, they go together like peanut butter and jelly. Those need to always be vectors. But I've talked a good bit now about vectors, so let's talk about rasters, because to be honest, most of us probably spend most of our time working with rasters, which are really just a fancy name for images that are made with pixels, not math. And they're often called bitmap images, which sometimes confuses the waters even more because people hear raster and bitmap and pixels and they think they're all different things, and in fact, they're not really. They're pretty much interchangeable. So they're often called bitmap images because they're made up of millions of these tiny little squares, and most of us are familiar with these. Those are pixels, right? And you can identify a raster/bitmap image just by looking at it really, really closely, because if you zoom in enough, you're going to be able to see those individual pixels, those little squares, especially around the edges where there are possibly dramatic color changes or contrasts. Now, raster graphics also typically have larger file sizes. And so, Stephanie, you were referring to Photoshop. Yes, very pricey. For years, I have avoided Photoshop, although I learned how to use it many, many years ago. I use Paint Shop Pro, which does pretty much everything Photoshop does at a fraction of the cost. It's like less than $100. So compared to the ongoing, very pricey subscription that Photoshop uses. We could, I love it, but we could talk about that another time. But yes, Photoshop and all of those Adobe products are quite expensive. So raster graphics typically have larger file sizes than their vector counterparts because it's not math. You have to literally map out each individual pixel. That's the name, bitmap, right? Yeah, and Deb, Inkscape is free, but Inkscape is also for vectors. That's what I use for vector graphics myself. Also a very good program, but for a different use. So when you have a raster graphic and you've got these individual pixels, one of the things you might be familiar with is the idea of higher DPI, or dots per inch, or even PPI, which is pixels per inch, because those can also make your files really large. The more pixels you have per inch, the better quality you end up with, but also the bigger the file size become, because each individual pixel, remember, has to be plotted out and mapped. So file size can become a concern if storage or server space is limited, or if you have to send it via email, you have to transmit it digitally in any way. Sometimes that can become a real issue. One thing that surprises some folks is that photographs are actually rasters, and in fact are the preferred method as raster images for working with photographs. When photos are taken with a digital camera, copied on a scanner, taken from your phone, the resulting files are actually raster images. So in printed mediums like books and magazines, raster images are often used to reproduce photographs, right? So images are saved at a very high DPI setting, DPI being dots per inch. Remember that? We just talked about that. In fact, if you've ever had to do anything with a raster image for print, you've probably been asked by your printer, we need it at a minimum of, say, 300 DPI. That's because they need more quality to that image in order to get a good print. Now, one kind of oddball, or a couple oddballs I want to talk about here in the raster slash vector world, and those are EPS and PDF files. So EPS stands for Encapsulated Postscript, and I only remember that because I look at my notes every time I do this session, even though I work with EPS fairly often. So these are self-contained files, and they're the same mathematically as vector files, but they can be created from raster images as well. So it's this kind of interesting hybrid. And in fact, many times if you've ever gotten a file back from your printer, especially of a logo or some kind of design, many times it will come as a .eps file. And it's one of the probably the main compatible file format for vectors. Most kinds of graphic software can open up a .eps file. They can't always open it as a vector, but they can usually at least open it. So it's this interesting hybrid, and it's got some sort of mass compatibility that other file formats like, say, .ai, Adobe Illustrator, don't have. So it's the most compatible and the portable because most graphic software supports EPS. And then there's the PDF, which probably everyone here has probably opened or read or created. It's so universal. What folks don't realize is that PDFs actually use a combination of vector and raster images. It literally is very much a hybrid of both. And files render as they were created. So vector images are rendered as a vector image. Raster images are rendered as a raster images. And if it's a vector image, you can extract it and scale it just like you would any other vector, which is pretty cool. And fonts that are embedded within a PDF file often can also be extracted and made bigger or smaller, just because, remember, fonts are typically vectors as well. Raster images, like, for example, photo, if you save it off as a PDF, will appear as intended at 100%, but it's going to start to lose quality if it's over large, because remember, it is still a raster image, and it's going to be embedded in there at a certain size and a certain quality. Okay, so there are three main rasters. Hope you're still with me. Okay, so these file extensions probably look familiar to most folks. These are the three main standard formats for pretty much everything graphical online. JPEGs, which sometimes you'll see as JEPG rather than just JPG, the GIF, and the PNG. And most browsers have typically no trouble displaying any of these three types, but some are actually better suited for certain uses than others. So while JPEGs are most commonly used for displaying photos and photorealistic images, they look fine while they maintain a fairly low file size. GIF files are widely supported as a format for animated images, although they do stills as well, but it's interesting. They used to be nothing but stills, and they have sort of evolved, whereas anything animated often has just become by default a GIF. And then there's PNG, which has the ability to maintain full quality pretty much all the time. So let's talk a little bit more about these, because chances are that you've worked with all three and might be especially confused about what is better than what here. So JPEG, think photographs. Remember I said these are rasters, even though that might surprise you. But JPEG compression is really great if you're just trying to send someone a picture through your phone or in your email. Two situations where you might not necessarily want to send really large files. So although most JPEGs look fine from a distance, under normal compression, there is a noticeable loss of quality whenever you zoom in. So there's a good deal of compression that happens with the JPEG format. Another thing to remember about JPEGs is that they don't support transparency. If you're not familiar with the idea of transparency, think of something like, let's say you have a picture of an apple, but the background of it is transparent so that you can put that apple over literally any other graphic and it will look like it belongs there without bringing its own background with it. JPEGs don't support transparency at all. But the good thing about JPEGs is, the reason that they're used so extensively for photographs, is they have pretty much an unlimited color palette. And the way that it does that, though, is it blends pixels together to reduce the size of the image. So it has a lot of colors. Pretty much all the colors are possible, but it does compress things a good bit in order to maintain a file size that isn't crazy big. So GIFs, I just talked about these and how it seems like every time we talk about GIFs anymore, we're talking about an animated GIF, but actually GIFs don't have to be animated. GIFs are for very simple things, very simple graphics, and part of that is because their color palette is extremely limited. It's 256 colors, and that's it. That part of that really is just to reduce the file size. It's not intended for a photograph. If you convert a photograph to a GIF format, you're going to be in for a rude awakening because pretty much millions of your colors are going to disappear. You only have 256 of them to choose from. And any colors outside of those 256 are found in that's just the standard web palette, are changed to whatever color is closest to, which is why if you convert a JPEG, like a photo, to a GIF, you're going to end up with something kind of wild looking because it's just making some sort of kind of educated guesses about what colors might match, considering it only has 256 to choose from. Now, GIFs, on the other hand, compared to JPEGs, do support transparency, but in a kind of strange way, because the way that they do it is they actually assign one of those 256 colors. So in reality, now you only have 255. They assign one of those to be the transparent color. So when you have transparency in a GIF, you're actually losing one of the colors in your palette that might otherwise be available to you. And pixels are either entirely transparent or entirely opaque. There is no in between. There's no gradient of transparency. That's something you're only going to get with PNG that we'll talk about next. Also, and another reason why you won't see transparency used with GIFs very often is because when it does do transparency, round edges often have a white backing. They don't necessarily sit directly against the background. So if you start looking at the edges, you get this weird kind of sporadic white outline, which isn't generally something anybody wants. So transparency, not great for GIFs, but if you have a very simple format or image, that isn't a photograph, this, compresses pretty well, and it does its job. And of course, then there's the animation, right? This is what everybody gets all excited about because everything that's there's animated GIFs everywhere. Pretty much all the animated images you're going to find on the web are GIFs. So a couple of the reasons why GIFs are so popular is their efficient file size. We talked about that. They have very few colors. They can make it a lot smaller. Simple creation process. Also, some of the built-in features allow for some really granular control over specific animation behaviors, which none of the other formats have. They can't animate at all. So you can control animation speed and whether the frames are persistent and how many times the animation repeats and all these kinds of fun things that help you make fun animated GIFs. So the last one, we've talked about JPEGs, we've talked about GIFs, now let's talk about PNGs. So this is when you have something more complex. It's not a photo, but it's a more complex image, and you also need transparency. The reason that I want you to think this way especially is because PNGs are significantly bigger file size-wise. And if you keep wondering why I am always harping on file size, it's because you need to remember our Google overlords have told us that when folks come to your site on mobile, if it loads in longer than 3 seconds, you've already lost 50% of your audience. Big companies spend millions of dollars every year optimizing their websites down by milliseconds in order not to lose customers. So file size is actually a really important consideration. But PNG support the most support they have, I guess, for transparency, but also for quality. But yes, it's bigger. There's always going to be that trade-off of quality versus file size. The bigger the quality, the bigger the file size is going to be. But you can allow for different levels of transparency. Remember how I said with GIFs, it's kind of an all or nothing proposition. It's either all transparent or none of it's transparent when it comes to an individual pixel. That is not the case with PNGs. So if you want something that needs more granular control, this is going to be your client right here. So you can have gradients essentially as far as transparency goes. I use PNGs a lot, especially if I'm working with small graphics and I want to keep the quality, but it's not always the best use case for everything. Okay, So now you're probably sick to death of formats, but you now know more than you ever need to know unless you're on graphic format Jeopardy. So let's talk about some best practices that you can use when you're creating or using images or getting them ready for the web. So the very first thing I want to talk about is optimizing. So what do I mean by optimizing? Let's say that you take photos of a library event, right? Most of the time you're going to take those photos on your camera, digital camera, or probably these days many of you are taking them directly on your cell phone. It doesn't matter. But you know that when you download those images onto, say, your desktop to get ready to work with them, and you want to see one of them at 100%, you blow it up and it's like, oh my gosh, that's huge at 100%. We know already that is way too big for Instagram or a website or a blog. We've got to make that smaller. And so they use some kind of software, Photoshop, or all kinds of other things to make it visually smaller so that it will fit. Everybody gets that part. Oh, that image is too big. I need to make it smaller. But that is only step one when you are working with images online. So that is because step two is to optimize them. So what does that mean? It means that that image, especially photos, but not only photos, has millions of pixels that the human eye cannot see. And what that does is it makes the file size much bigger than it needs to be. And remember, I harp constantly on download time when we're talking about digital assets. You've got to make them not only visually smaller, but the file size needs to be smaller. So when I say optimizing, I'm talking about removing pixels the human eye can't see. Just because you have a large image doesn't mean you need to have a large image file size. So if you have, say, a big image for the rotating carousel on your library's homepage, yes, it's a pretty big image, but that doesn't mean it has to take forever to download. That's the nice thing about optimization, because when you optimize it, really what you're doing is you're compressing it, and it can drastically reduce the file size of an image, even up to 90% in some cases, without reducing the quality to the naked human eye at all. And this is, by the way, not something with someone who's like your graphic designer or a printer sends you proofs. They're not going to optimize their stuff. They want a high quality image that they're sending you. But when you're uploading an image for social media or to your website, you absolutely need to do this with pretty much everything. So why do this? First, you've heard me talk about this forever already. Faster loading. It's because it provides a superior experience for your users. You don't want people to be, oh, this library site's too slow, forget it. That's not good. It also actually improves your relationship with Google, and heaven knows we want the Google overlords to like us. Forgive my sarcasm. I'm always sarcastic about Google. I recognize they kind of rule the web, and it is what it is. But Google loves faster sites and will improve your search ranking based on that speed. So the more time that you can squeeze off of your site load, the better. Also, your patrons will like you more for the same reason. It's faster. They're not waiting for these images to download. And remember, too, folks, more than 50% of your audience is coming to you on a mobile device, more than 50%, and that's the minimum these days. And for some of you, it might be much higher, like if you're an academic library. So the more time you can squeeze off of those sites, the better. Remember, most of us out here, we do not have unlimited data plans. So every time we have to download an image that's big, we're literally paying for it in bandwidth and in data. So we're going to like you better if stuff downloads faster. Also, an important thing for those of you who are using your images in, say, Constant Contact or MailChimp or any other kind of email marketing, when your images are big, most mail clients are more likely to mark it as spam. So the more optimized your images are, the less likely it is that one of your library's marketing emails is going to end up in somebody's junk folder. So a tool that you can use to do this magical optimization, and this is just one of many, and if you use Photoshop or PaintShop Pro, many robust graphic design tools have this built in some way or as a plugin like GIMP. But if you don't have those, that's okay. You can do this for free. There are actually probably hundreds of these kinds of tools. This is just one of my favorite. I like their iguana. This comes off the front page of compressor.io. And you can see that this iguana started off life as at 700 kilobytes, and afterwards was 250 kilobytes. According to their math, it's 64% file compression, and you can't tell the difference, which is the point. And in fact, you may notice with many photographs, it actually becomes a little sharper because some of the blurriness that was on the edge of some of those pixels may disappear. So you can't hurt yourself at all. In fact, you can almost always just help yourself and your patrons by doing this. And in this case, it's free. You don't even have to register. You literally upload your image. It does its magic compression. You download the new version. Ta-da, you're done. So that's compressor.io, but there are many others. These are just a few, and I think you'll be getting a recording of this, so if you don't catch these right now, don't worry. One that's not on there, I'm trying to think. I think it's Optimizilla is not on there, but it actually does thing in batches. So if you have a bunch of images to compress at one time, you can do that up to 20 at a time, I think, with Optimizilla. I'm not remembering if any of these others do batches, but they all do essentially the same thing. How you actually name your image also matters. When you're naming your image files, separate words with either a hyphen or an underscore. You should never have spaces in the name of your image because the file name, first of all, many browsers kind of freak out at spaces in image names. They don't know what to do with them, or they start adding special characters, and that's never a good situation. But more importantly, the name of your image actually helps search engines as well. It helps search engines understand what the images and that page are about. So when you add information like this to your image, you're helping search engines as well. Another thing with images, how many of you are familiar with alternative text for images? Most social media sites, not all of them, unfortunately, most of them have this. I know Twitter does, I think Instagram does. But also most websites and blogs have alternative text. Sometimes they're called alt tags. Well, I'm not doing accessibility today, although that's a whole nother ballgame I love to talk about. But at the very least, you have to understand that not everyone is coming to your library's website or social media on just a plain old browser. Many of them may be using some kind of assistive technology. In this case, I'm talking about specifically screen readers, say NVDA or JAWS, that literally read the page to the person. So that means when you don't have alternative text for an image, they literally can't get anything from that. It will just simply say often picture or image, nothing useful. So alternative text is really important. And I'm going to put something into the chat. And Deb, I apologize. I don't know how you're going to interpret this, but maybe it doesn't matter in this case. I'm typing. You can't see me, folks, but I'm typing. I'm being a little slow. Therapy talk. Okay. So there is a typical image tag in HTML, and you can see the image is simply that telling the browser here is an image. SRC stands for source. In this case, it's dog.jpg, so it's a photo of a dog. But the most important part here is alt, which is the alternative text. And this is what a screen reader is going to read to someone. In this case, child reading to a therapy dog. And not only is this good for accessibility, but this is another thing that Google and other search engines actually log onto or kind of pay attention to, is not just the name of the image, but what alt text is attached to it. So this is something that can help two different ways. So again, it's a no-lose proposition here to use alt tags. When you're resizing things, when you're using a program like Photoshop, for example, or PaintShop Pro, the quick and dirty way to resize things is to use whatever the built-in function is. But it's important to remember that you should probably do it in 10% increments just to see what the quality becomes when you, and this is especially when you're making things bigger, you can lose quality very quickly. You've probably seen this for yourselves. Just keep doing 10% enlargements until the distortion is more than you can stand, and then back it down 1 or 2 steps. And once you've done that, you also want to make sure that you adjust the sharpness of an image. Once you've upsized it or downsized it, typically you need to adjust the sharpness at least a little bit, because you're going to lose some of the crispness that image had to begin with. Speaking of size, here is a rotating banner image that I pulled from a public library's website. And as you can see, it's kind of distorted and a little pixelated and stretched out. When you're creating an image, you always want to create it at the correct size. Often resizing, remember, raster images, resizing doesn't always go well for us. So you always want to create as big as possible. This clearly was created too small, and then they tried to stretch it out to the right parameters. Don't do that, because you end up, unfortunately, with things like this, which is not a good look. So better to make something too big and then size it down. That's usually a better chance of coming out well than the other way, where you start too small and then you try to stretch it out to whatever you need. So I want to talk a little bit about quality as well. These are some real life examples. I realize I work with a lot of small and medium-sized public libraries, and believe me, I get it that they do not necessarily have graphic design expertise on staff. In fact, I don't refer to myself as a graphic designer. I don't pretend to that title or that avocation. That's not what I do. I do some graphic design stuff, but I would never call myself a graphic designer by any means. That's way beyond my talent. But there are definitely some things to consider for those of us who are not graphic designers. And one of the first things I want to talk about are some really low quality images that you shouldn't have on your library's website. This is one I pulled, yes, from a real life website. I'm not going to give out any names, but this is clearly clip art. You're not going to wow anybody with this. Nobody's going to want to share that if it's on social media. It doesn't make your institution look good. The line I use with libraries and have for years is you do not want to be using the same clip art that my son was putting on his 3rd grade book report. It's not a good look for any organization that relies on funding from anybody outside of itself. If you can fund yourself entirely, have at it, but nobody I know can do that. So you don't want your community's organization to be represented by this kind of artwork, because your visual content is a direct reflection of the quality of your library's brand. Now, this is not a marketing seminar, but brand doesn't mean just your logo. It's everything that your library does that the community sees. This is not a good look. So if you're using clip art, please stop, because you're making me cry. If for no other reason than you're making Laura cry, please stop doing this. If you don't have the budget or the resources for a good photographer, and you're not one, and believe me, I relate, I do not do photography well. Stock photos are at least a step up. You may not love them. There's issues with those also, but at least it's not this. That's the best that we can say about it. There's a lot of high quality content out there that's either free or that you can buy at a fairly low cost when you need it. Some things to consider for your quality checklist today. Is it high resolution? Are your images a high enough resolution so they don't appear pixelated? And can you read the text on the images clearly? When we put text on top of some kind of image like a rotating banner or something for social media, it needs to be really clear. And do your photos or your graphics, do they look like possibly someone could have done that professionally? One of my favorite tools, by the way, is Canva for libraries. I don't know if any folks here use canva.com. They have, I believe that for W3Cs, not W3Cs, 501Cs, it's free or very reduced price. It's a great tool. It's very hard, I always say, to make anything bad with Canva. They have a ton of templates that you can modify for your own content. It's a fabulous tool. I recommend it if you're not using it. There's a free version. I actually use the free version because I tend to do my own graphics a lot of the time, although a couple times I have used Canva for that. A lot of folks are big fans of Canva, for sure. Good, I'm glad to see some folks using it. So I want to show you some examples. Yes, canva.com, Dean, that is correct. canva.com. I want to show you some examples of some artwork that is not okay. So these are bad. Yes, it's very easy to use, Helen. You are right. That's one of the reasons I like to recommend it. So here are some things. These are 4 different images. Hopefully they're not making your eyeballs bleed. But Stephanie says, ouch. Yeah, these are not good for a whole variety of reasons that we could spend time picking these apart, but these all come from real libraries. I've redacted any identifying information for the purposes of this webinar, but these are all real, and they're all the kinds of things that make me go into a closet and sob. These are not things you ever want to see on a library's website, because the message that you're sending to your community is that we have nobody on board. Maybe this is how you pass the levy. I don't know. Is my bad artwork and trying to get more money, but probably not. So these are not good things. And most of us, I think, can point at these and go, oh, those are pretty awful. At least we're not doing that. So maybe that makes you feel better about your own artwork. Maybe. I'm not sure. But how about something like this, which is really kind of, it's pixelated, it's blurry. This was actually accompanied a post about believe it or not, a pumpkin painting program. And I looked at this and said, okay, aside from the quality of the image, which obviously has issues, why is this next to a pumpkin painting program? This is not conveying what the program is actually about. You know, this could even have been photoshopped pretty easily to look like something that was painted, or they could have found something else or taken a picture of a finished product. So you also want your image to at least convey the actual meaning of the item that it's accompanying. So here's a couple others that are good. So, and I don't know for sure, but these both look like they're possibly things that came out of canva.com. I don't know for sure, but these are both very clean. They look really good. They convey a fair amount of information without overwhelming someone with text on an image, which is really easy to do. This is a common problem. So people love visual content on social media because it's easy to digest, right? And once you have too much text on your images, it has the complete opposite effect. So a picture is worth 1,000 words, and in an age where our attention span is tiny, mine's smaller than that, it's really going to serve us better not to overwhelm people. So when you put a lot of text on an image, you think, oh, I'm giving people a lot of information. Many times what's happening is the direct opposite, is that you're turning people away and they're not even going to absorb or look at that information. So here's a couple examples. You might not be able to tell what this is out of context, but this is text I found. This was actually an image that was in a rotating carousel on a library's homepage. This is not only too much text, but it's text over text, which I did not understand at all. For those of you who might be familiar with author Stephen Krug, that's Krug, he wrote a great book. It's been out for a while, gone through several editions, called Don't Make Me Think. If you've never read it, go get it. It's fabulous. It's written for the layperson. It's thin. It's full color pictures. It's an easy read, but it teaches people very quickly why things like this are bad. And one of those things is Krug's third law, which says cut down your stuff basically to 25% of what you started with. So if this is 100%, only 25% of this should actually be on your home page. So this is way, way too much text. Another example of this that's not quite as obvious, here's another one. There's too much text going on here because there's text on the book cover, there's text on the top half of the main section kind of over to the right, and then you also have text on top of a starburst shape at the bottom. The eye doesn't know where to go here. There is too much information, especially if this was in a rotating banner. No one's going to have time to read all this. This is too much information in one place. And this is a more common thing that I tend to see. Here's another one. This was on a home page. 2 images, and it's formatted kind of funny, but aside from that, this is still too much text for the homepage. And people always say, well, Laura, we have to tell people all this stuff somewhere. Yes, you do. But on your home page, you want just a little teaser, like a sentence, maybe two tops, and then people should click to get the rest of the information. Nobody's going to read paragraphs of text. In fact, study after study shows people will actively leave and run away from you if they see a wall of text. So this is simply too much. Another thing to consider when we talk about best practices are trends. Now, I grew up in the 70s. We had orange shag carpet. I don't think we ever had avocado green appliances, but maybe some of you of a similar age can relate. Nobody would probably put those things into your house now unless you were purposely trying to be like really hipstery and retro. People don't want that. So you have to pay attention. Dean had avocado appliances. Gen X, we're coming out of the woodwork now. But trends on the web, you can't follow them every way they go. You do have to be a little aware, though, that some things are gone. Gradients are in, but not like this. This is a very, very sharp gradient. The gradients that you see now in the 2020s, so to speak, are very subtle. And this looks like something from the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. So you don't want things that are going to date your site either, because that's something else where people are going to look at it and go, it's not hipstery, it's not cool, I'm out of here. All right, let's talk about social media. So where images are often the main thing that you're posting, for many of you, I'm going to guess, especially if you're on a very visual channel like, say, Instagram. So one of the most important things that you can do is to format your image for the platform, because if you don't format your image for the right platform the right way, your images are going to appear cropped and probably kind of low quality, and that's not going to impress anyone, right? So you always want to check the correct dimensions for your social media designs before you even start designing. So here's an example that I took from this place that I linked to in case you want to see the whole thing. But you can see it's essentially the same image shaped a different way, because I'm going to talk more about this in just a moment, how each social media platform has its own requirements. But sometimes what I'll see, and I get it, it's really easy to make one image and then just upload it everywhere. But that doesn't do anyone any favors, and you spent time making the image, so you might as well make it look good everywhere you're going to put it. So you're going to want to tweak it for the platform. So limitations for social images are a combination of dimensions, and image size, and even the amount of text that's displayed within the image. We used to do a lot of advertising for our agency and use Google Ads, sorry, not Google Ads, Facebook ads, and some of you may have run into this. They want a very specific amount of text that they will allow, and once you try to go past that, it's like 10% of the image maybe can be text. Once you go past that, they won't approve it, and the ad won't run. So you have to be careful about those things. But another thing you have to be careful about, and another reason why you should format for the platform, is I want to caution you against uploading really oversized images to social media sites. And this is because, yes, they're going to reduce the size for you. And you think, that's really convenient. They're taking care of this for me. I don't have to do it. But the problem is that they're going to use really aggressive image compression, and you've got this big image, and they're going to squish it way down in a way that you may not like, and they're going to remove lots and lots of pixels to compress it really tight. Remember, they've got literally billions of images being uploaded every day. Server space is something they take care of and take very seriously. So upload things at the right size so it's not going to be compressed quite as aggressively, because you don't want blurry images. So if you want to, you can compress the image with your own service or plugin or your own software. If you do that before you upload it, again, it's not going to need to compress it quite so much on the end of the platform that you're uploading it to. You don't want, again, you put in a lot of work. You don't want to end up with something that looks like garbage by the time that you're all done. And so be careful of that as well. And this is something that gets updated every year, which is why I share this one. I've been sharing it for, 5 or 6 years, and they're always really good about updating this. But every year, most social media platforms tend to tweak their size requirements just enough to annoy us. So it's important to keep up with what's actually happening. So here is a link, and again, I think you'll get a recording. You can grab this if you don't get it right now. To the cheat sheet for 2020 to get the image sizes that you might need for your site. So let's talk a little bit, though, about most of the major platforms. I don't know, do we have any Pinterest folks on here? Any folks who manage Pinterest for their library? I know I spend way too much time on Pinterest. That's like my safe social media platform. There's nothing scary there. No. Someone says no. Got a yes? Okay. I know this isn't as popular, even though it's me. I love Pinterest. But for those of you who are, Caitlin, we'll have a support group. She loves it too. Alina says my name. Yeah, I use it for ideas a lot. Caitlin says I get lost. I know, I do too. We'll have a support group after the webinar for those of us who are addicted to Pinterest. But aside from that, those of us who have to manage social media for Pinterest, it's kind of the outlier in many ways because it has this very unique, what's called a masonry layout in the web design world, where it's got all these blocks that kind of fit into each other and they're different sizes, at least lengthwise. But that is one of the reasons why when you're creating images for Pinterest, you actually want to go for tall images. You actually want to take up more room vertically because you're going to get more attention that way. Typically, right now, this is the 2020 number, so don't hold me to this after this year, but right now the number is 222 pixels wide is the ideal, but you can go as tall as you want, which is kind of cool. Because taller images grab more screen real estate than square or landscape images, which it kind of assigns to just part of a pin, and then it gives you a little text and you're done, and it's a standard size. Instagram also is kind of a weird one. Stephanie, the dimensions for Pinterest is 222 pixels wide by whatever you want long height. And the more height you have, the better when it comes to getting attention on Pinterest. No problem. So I almost called this Photoshop because I was looking at the logo, which is a camera. This is Instagram. You'd think I'd know this. You can upload non-square things to Instagram, but often what it does is it actually likes squares. Instagram is square. It likes squares. It produces squares. It makes 1080 by 1080 squares. Now, that's what it wants, is 1080 by 1080. What's kind of interesting, though, is that by the time Instagram gets all done compressing and resizing your image, even though it said it wanted 1080 by 1080, it actually compresses it down and resizes it to 612 by 612. So basically about a little less than half. My math is terrible. But anyway, just be aware it wants one size and creates another. Instagram is kind of weird that way. But with everything else, for the most part, your best bet is simply to go horizontal. The optimal choice is horizontal. If you're talking about Facebook right now, you can actually upload square images, but wider images have a more sophisticated look when you've got that landscape layout. So sorry about the phone call. I'm stuck someplace where I can't turn off the phone. I'm going to let the phone stop ringing. Okay, I think we're done. Sorry, my apologies. So Facebook, you can upload squares and it will keep it as a square. So in theory, you could kind of create the same image for Instagram and Facebook, but it may not be still, again, remember, Facebook is still going to be a little different, and it prefers rectangles for the most part, and you get that more sophisticated landscape layout, because our eyes are used to seeing professional photos especially, but for professional images in a landscape layout. So horizontal is the best. Check that cheat sheet for the numbers. But another thing to remember, especially about Facebook, when we talk about aggressive compression algorithms, Facebook is number one. So you're going to want to be really careful about what you upload, and don't make it too big because they are very aggressive. And that part of that simply because it gets so much use and they're holding so much stuff, they've got to be pretty tight with their space allotments. This is just a fun tool I wanted to share for those of you who have trouble when you post things from Twitter. Sometimes you don't always get the image you want with it. This is a neat tool called TwitShot that you can grab that will do that. You can get the images from your link and attach them to your tweets, and you get the one that you want. Sometimes you don't always get that with Twitter. Okay, so I know we're getting close to time. I have just a couple little things I want to share with you, and I'm also happy to take questions that I may not have answered yet. And so, of course, I've just told you all these things to do with your images. And Laura, where do we get these magical images? We don't have a photographer on staff. Well, I mentioned stock photos as one. Of course, I also mentioned Canva.com, which is not so much photos, although it does have photos, but it's templates for creating full-fledged social media or even print posts. But what about other needs that you might have? So this is the point at which if you've got a favorite site for free images, photos, graphics, whatever, I'm going to ask you to share those. I'm going to share, though, just a few of mine. And before I do that, I have to give the obligatory lecture because my son, he's now going to be a sophomore in high school, but he has had a school-issued Chromebook since the 3rd grade. And he has been taught by his school system since he got that school-issued Chromebook in the 3rd grade that it is perfectly okay to go to Google Images and get an image for his book report. So he may go there and type in dogs and pull up a picture of a dog and put that in his book report about dogs. And what blows my mind is that I still run into folks who work in libraries who think this is okay. I know that's not any of you, but I now feel like this is an obligatory thing I have to say because it happens to me every year where I run into someone who says, oh, we just grabbed this off Google Images. And it's not helping that, at least my son's school district is teaching this as an okay thing to do. This is not an okay thing to do. Most of these are copyrighted, and fair use doesn't necessarily cover you plugging it into your library's website or social media. That's a whole different seminar on copyright and fair use. There is a setting on Google Images that you can use to find things that are, for example, Creative Commons licenses or free to use with modification and things like that. Google image search is not always your friend. In fact, I would go as far to say it's almost never your friend. As tempting as it is to just go to Google, this is not okay. And if you think that you're a library and nothing will happen to you, let me tell you a little story about why this is not okay. I work at a state library. We're essentially an arm of the Ohio State Library. It's called the Ohio Public Library Information Network, and we're an interesting little agency. We're essentially the ISP, the Internet Service Provider for libraries here in Ohio. And so when the FBI has any issues, they come to us because we manage the IP ranges for all of the public libraries. When legal enforcement of any kind has issues, they typically start with us. We're used to privacy problems and people downloading movies on library computers. That's all par for the course. It happens every day. But one time, just a few years ago, we got a new kind of a call we hadn't gotten from anyone before, and it was from Gannett. I think it was Gannett Images. So if you're not familiar with, or I think it's Gannett Images, there's a very large provider of stock photography for major newspapers. And I may not have the name right now that I'm thinking about it. Gannett might be the owner of newspapers. But at any rate, they called us. We'd never gotten a call from anybody this big before. And said, we have found a library that has stolen one of our stock photos and is using it on our website. What do we do? Getty, thank you, Gail. I knew it started with a G. It's Getty Images. Yes, we've never gotten a call from Getty Images. It wasn't Gannett, although they do provide to Gannett newspapers, among others. And as it turned out, this public library here in Ohio, again, will remain nameless, had taken a Getty photo, just taken it off the web, used it on their website, and they got slammed with a really, really big fine because they used it without permission. So if you don't think this happens to libraries, I can tell you from my own firsthand experience, yes, it absolutely does. People are very protective of their intellectual property. Don't think just because we're libraries that we're in any kind of special case fair use situation. In many cases, we are not. Anyway, here are my favorites for, and again, share yours. The first two are the ones that I probably use the most. Pixabay actually might be becoming my new favorite for stock photos. Unsplash is my second favorite. Unsplash has more esoteric kinds of things, and Elizabeth is putting in a few. Pexels.com, which I think is on my list too. Yep. Pixabay, I got that one. Unsplash. Now this one's new to me. Vecteezy.com. That one I haven't seen before. Thank you for sharing. So there's lots of places to get this art. In virtually all these cases, you can use it unfettered without attribution, and you can modify it, which are two conditions that I often look for, is that you don't have to modify it, or sorry, you can modify it, and you don't have to attribute it. That means basically it's free to use. So I want to talk very quickly, because I'm at time, your big takeaways for today that you need to remember when you go home. Know your formats and which ones to use and why. And for most of you, that's going to be the difference between the three main raster formats, GIF and PNG and JPEG. You want to optimize your images. You're not making friends when you don't, especially you're not making friends with Google, and you're not making friends with mobile users. Use those best practices. You saw some examples of things that were good and things that were not so good. You don't want to inadvertently turn people off. You can't afford to do that anymore. There's too many other things competing for people's attention. So don't do things that will, turn people away right away. And social media platforms, the rules change all the time. They change at least annually. So you have to keep track of that. I'm sorry, it's a pain. I know, I deal with it too. But they only have their own rules, their own recommendations, and so keep aware of those. So I'm happy to take any questions. I can stay here for a few more minutes, because I know I ran right up to time, but I did try to get questions in context as they came up. I know there's a lot of information here, and I want to say thank you, and I appreciate your time today with me, as I told you an awful lot more than you ever wanted to know about images.
While people might be typing their questions, I'm going to go ahead and do the outro. Thank you, Laura, for an informative webinar this morning. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Laura.